Well, hello and welcome to the Eagle and Child podcast. Thank you for joining us today. I'm super excited about our very next episode. We are looking at Saint Teresa of Avila, one of the doctors of the church, just an amazing woman of God, super inspirational. I know you're going to love her story and everything that we will learn about today. Also, can't wait to interview my friend, Dr. Ali Cawthorn. Dr. Ali Cawthorn, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, hello. It is my absolute pleasure. I'm excited.
So good to see you.
Yes.
Yeah, so Dr. Ali Cawthorn, she is a woman of many talents. She has a doctorate from, is it Fuller Theological Seminary? Yes.
Yep.
On Ignatian spirituality. And she also, her and her husband are pastors of a church called Urban Church in Perth, Western Australia, which is an awesome church. It's full of hungry people, full of the Holy Spirit, going after spiritual gifts and all this sort of stuff. Just an incredible revival church. And she is also on the national executive for the Australian Christian churches in Australia. So what a Wonder Woman. Thank you so much for even spending the time with us on the Eagle and Child podcast. You sound like a very busy lady.
Oh, of course. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. And I love Teresa. So one of my favorites.
Is awesome. Oh, I've been looking forward to this episode for a long time. Even from like season 1, we talked about Teresa of Avila. I am just so excited about her. I mentioned her. I did a speaking in tongues course for Theos U, and I mentioned one of the parts of Interior Castle, she actually talks about speaking in tongues as a part of her prayer. So I just love her. I think she is just amazing. So can you give us a little bit of a background into who she is? How was she formed spiritually? Where does she come from?
Absolutely. So she was born in 1515 in Spain. There was something in the water. I think I said this last time about Ignatius of Loyola, because he was born around the same time. In Spain, actually in a place called Avila, which is where we get the name Teresa of Avila. And it's an area just sort of northwest of Madrid. So in that particular space, and she was born Teresa de Ahumada. And if I was Spanish, I'd be able to say that much better. But anyway,
I think it sounded good to me. So,
and she's one of 10 children, and her family had these hidden Jewish roots, actually. So, at the time of the Inquisition, practicing any sort of Judaic practice was, potentially deadly, actually. So it wasn't celebrated at all. And they were considered impure. And so her grandfather actually discovered that they were under suspicion from the Inquisition for practicing Judaism in their home. And he was actually quite wealthy. So what he did was purchased the status of nobility. In that time, you could purchase a higher social status, which meant that his children had access to the noble class and they could marry well. So after this, though, her grandfather actually confessed to practicing Judaism, and the punishment for the whole family, which obviously included Teresa's father, Alfonso, was to be marched through the streets of Toledo for 7 Fridays in a row, and they had to wear these costumes of bright yellow that were emblazoned with the family cross and snakes.
Whoa.
Yeah, and they were made to kneel in every church and every chapel, every shrine in the city, and the townspeople threw stones at them and spat at them and abused them.
Whoa.
So Teresa's father, Alfonso, was the youngest of the children. He endured this, but he wanted to make sure that he had a life of privilege and status for his own family. So he worked hard at that. And they actually he came to a form of faith, but obviously had a bit of baggage over this, the way that they had been.
Of course. Some trauma.
Yeah,
some
absolutely.
church hurt.
Talk about church hurt. So he marries Beatrice, and both of them were quite, sensitive to the law. They had a faith, but it wasn't until later in life that Teresa actually rekindles his love for God in a real way. potentially sort of brings him to a true faith, if you like. And so she's born into this family, high status. They had wealth, but this kind of complicated religious past. But Teresa as a child was really interested in God and faith and that sort of thing. But at around 12, 14, there's some conjecture as to exactly what age, but let's just say 13. Her mother actually dies giving birth, and it's devastating for Teresa, and she totally goes off the rails. She's a real wild child, and it was really hard on her father, who was widowed and then bringing up these 10 children on his own. But Teresa was just this extraordinary young woman, and a leader right from the get-go. So she had this wild kind of period in her life, and she started to influence her siblings and her cousins, and she's like, let's have these adventures. And they actually ran away. She ran away twice with one of her brothers because they wanted to go to the Americas to take on a new land. Like, she was just ready to go. What happens is her behavior becomes so difficult and so problematic that at around 16, now I don't know if anyone listening, I'm sure they have had girls from that age, kind of 13 to 16 is tricky. It's an interesting age. And so
shout out to your daughters.
Well, they're beautiful.
Yeah.
But there's just some waters to navigate at around those years. So at 16, her father sends her to Our Lady of Grace boarding school, Catholic boarding school in Avila. And he thought, this is going to straighten her out. It's going to, remove all the temptations that she has to be this kind of wild,
wild child. Yeah.
But while she's there, she actually finds herself really enjoying the lifestyle of, prayer. Yeah, she starts to seek God as to whether or not he might be calling her to a monastic vocation.
Wow.
And she thinks he is. God is calling me to this. But her father was a little bit annoyed because he's like, I just wanted you to sort out your behavior. I just wanted you to grow up a little bit. I did not think that you would receive this religious call.
Become some Jesus freak.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly. This wasn't part of his plan. So he's like, I want you to come home and I want you to get married and settle down. And actually, I'd read that around that time, often women would choose to actually join a monastic order rather than get married because in some ways they thought it would be a bit of an easier life.
That's hilarious.
We won't go there. So, anyway, she comes home. He's like, why don't you get married? She's like, no, I know that I'm being called to this. And so at 20, she enters a Carmelite monastery, which was called the Monastery of the Incarnation. And at about this same time, she actually starts having some significant issues with her health. She had fainting spells and fevers, and she was often bedridden for long periods of time. She had to take time off, to take leave from the monastery to return to her father's house to recuperate. And it was during one of these times when she went back home to, recuperate that she encounters the teachings on silent prayer because her uncle starts to read aloud some writings on silent prayer. And she feels this draw to a contemplative life, just like this is what I'm being called to, this life of prayer. And eventually her father agrees and she takes the vows of monastic life. But throughout her life, she continues to struggle with her health, and the records show that she had periods of kind of paralysis. She'd have crippling headaches. She'd have inflamed joints. Some people have said it sounds a little bit like a fibromyalgia kind of thing of today, but obviously wasn't diagnosed. But she just unwell. But she was just this incredibly charismatic person. So despite these physical ailments, her personality continued to shine through, and she was a really popular spiritual director, really popular teacher, and people would come to the monastery where she was and just seek her out, seek her counsel, seek her direction. She was also considered a very attractive woman, so she was
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, she was extroverted, and she actually knew how to use her charms really well. It was.
Oh, is this going to get scandalous?
Well, I mean, there is some scandal in her early life, which I've sort of left. But
left out.
What is funny, there's this funny story, because she was, brought before the Inquisition at times, and other times where she was questioned by, men in authority over the things that she was writing and the things that she was teaching. And it was said that at one point she was able to use her charm directly with these men, like bat her eyelids and kind of natural wit and this charm. And she would, demonstrate this incredible insight with the things that she would write. And then she'd say, but, I'm just a woman. I'm not, what would I know? And
what would I know? Yeah.
And they were like, oh, yeah, you're all right. let her go. It was actually incredible that she was let go on so many occasions. And they say that comes down directly to her charm and her beauty and her the way she held herself. Wow. But she was just really drawn to this quiet prayer, this deep contemplative way of being, and that actually then forms the foundation for her classic, The Interior Castle, that she'll write sometime later. Her health continues to be a problem. At one point in her life, she actually slips into a coma. And she was about to have the last rites read over her. Like, she was that sick. And then it says all of a sudden she opened her eyes, and they'd even put wax on her eyelids thinking this was it. She opened her eyes. I know. She has this miraculous recovery. And from then on, her devotion to God just reaches this whole nother level or depth.
Wow. That's
cool. Often when you think about Teresa, she's known for these mystical encounters that she had. Yeah. She had radical mystical encounters with God. She would often, be in trances and all sorts of things. She had these amazing visions, but actually they didn't begin to happen for her until she was around 40 years of age. So for 2 decades prior to that, so she enters the monastery at 20. After 40, these encounters start to begin. So for 2 decades, she'd just been faithful in developing this lifestyle prayer in the midst of, extreme health challenges. But, her inner life was sort of stayed a bit ordinary. She's just faithful to that practice, faithful to the Lord. Anything that was thrown away, she just continued. But then she starts to have these encounters. It's like, this is where it gets.
Come on. Yeah. And we should just mention here as well, she's a very well respected doctor of the church, the Universal Church, right? So she's not some weirdo fringe person that's like having these trance encounters or whatever. She's very embraced by the historic church as someone who is legit, and so
yes.
I love that.
Yeah, she's declared a doctor of the church in 1970 by the Pope.
Yes.
The first female, actually, doctor of the church. She wrote shaped the church significantly. So these encounters begin. She's wandering the grounds of the monastery, and she sees this statue of Jesus. During his trial, he's been imprisoned by the Romans, and this statue just kind of catches her eye. And she writes, the next thing I know, she's just lying down in front of this statue, absolutely sobbing. And it's like the image of the suffering that Jesus went through, allowed her to really get in touch with some of her remorse and the pain that she'd been carrying for decades. And she speaks about getting up off the floor after that encounter and feeling as if she'd been reborn.
Wow.
Rebirthing. And from then on, it just accelerates. She has these, states of ecstasy and rapture, and I imagine it's similar to the ones that Paul talks about in Corinthians, it's caught up in other place. She has visions of the resurrected Christ speaking to her about various things, giving her insight into things. One of the phrases she hears is, now I want you to speak not to men but with angels. So it's like she just had this call to live into and from this whole other realm. And so she, like prayer is just the foundation of her life, and these raptures start to increase, and sometimes they're quite public, and she would be in this trance-like state for hours, and people had to check to see that she was still breathing. They're like,
crazy,
she's still alive. And
yeah,
I know. And she finds this really quite embarrassing. She's like, do you really have to do this to me in public? And there's this really funny story. She's singing in the choir, and the other sisters all start to look at her because it said she started to levitate off the ground. And when she looked down, she said, "Put me down to the Lord," and he lowered back down. So quite interesting encounters that are documented that she had.
That's funny.
Another one, she has this encounter with Jesus as a child, and he asked her who she was, and she said, "I am Teresa of Jesus. Who are you?" And he replied, "I am Jesus of Teresa."
Wow.
So beautiful.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And of course, her kind of most famous encounter was captured by the Italian sculptor Bernini. It's called Saint Teresa in Ecstasy, and it's a sculpture of her kind of in this state, and an angel has plunged a sword into her heart, which just sets her on fire.
Wow, beautiful.
Yes. She actually said that I had that experience several times in my life, and she says the soul's just not satisfied with anything less than God. So this amazing woman, really charismatic, has these encounters with the Lord in 1562, not 19. 1562, she actually starts to feel like the order that she's a part of needs a reformation. So she sets out to reform the order that she's a part of, to bring back simplicity and silence and poverty and contemplative prayer. And then 1567, she meets John of the Cross, who wrote Dark Night of the Soul. He was also a monk who was really disillusioned by what he was seeing, by the lack of kind of piety, the lack of following the Lord that he saw. And when he meets Teresa, he's on his way to live a life as a hermit in the mountains. He's like, "I'm totally done. I'm out of here." And so she convinces him, "Well, why don't you join me and we'll reform this order." And so they do that together. They become these, beautiful soul companions. And, people say that she was his spiritual director, but she actually says that, he would ask her questions that would stir her soul. So I guess they were kind of more like soul companions, stirring one another.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And so all throughout Spain, they start to reform the order, and they, establish these monasteries called the Carmelites of the Primitive Rule, or the Barefoot Carmelites. And they got that name because they would wear these hemp sandals year round, even through winter. And those sandals were this commitment that they had to simple values and just this absolute devotion to the Lord. So
I love that.
Amazing life. She founded 17 Carmelite houses all throughout Spain.
Wow.
And then in 1582, when she was 67, she finally succumbs to her ill health, and it happens. She's on her way to start another convent in the north of the country, and as she's on her way, a duchess summons her because she said, I'd like you to be at the birth of my first grandchild. The weather is absolutely terrible. The conditions of the trip were really bad. And so Teresa gets there and says, I'm not feeling well. I'm going to go to bed. And she never gets up again.
Wow.
Said that as she, took her last breath, she utters the words, beloved, it's time to move on. And she says, well, then may your will be done, my Lord and my spouse. The hour that I've longed for has come. It's time for us to meet one another. And that was
beautiful.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. And like I said, in 1970, she becomes a doctor of the church, and she's just remained this icon for, charismatic, independent, reformative women.
Wow.
Yeah.
And here, like in her time period as well, is very,
Amazing.
It's just crazy. Hey, incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for giving us that overview. What an incredible overview. What an incredible life. You did mention like one of her works, The Interior Castle. What are some works that she's well known for, and what are they about? And if you can give us maybe some.
Yeah. So The Interior Castle, I'll come to in a minute, because that's by far her best known and incredible book on the formation of our soul, and that diving into the depths of God. She also wrote an autobiography, which she had to write twice because the first one fell into the hands of the Inquisition and she never got it back. So
how annoying.
I know.
Anyone who's ever written anything, it would be like, you can just imagine having to start all over again.
I know. And it's sort of, there's three parts to that. So the first part is, her life, her family life, the grace she's received from God, her vocational call. Then the second section is about prayer, and she unpacks prayer. In this particular book, she likens the soul to a garden and the different ways that you can water the garden in terms of, different forms of prayer. The third part is a description of some of the experiences she's had. The fourth part speaks of mystical marriage, and that is an image that she carries into Interior Castle as well. And, she talks about the Lord being her spouse. And so, that idea of that mystical marriage is really a big part of her life. She also wrote a book called The Way of Perfection, where she offers some really practical advice on a life of prayer. And that was particularly for the other nuns, the Carmelite nuns. So she wanted to teach them. She writes a commentary on the Lord's Prayer. The Book of Foundations, also really, I guess that's a little bit like the constitutions that Ignatius wrote as he set up an order, but just discusses how, the founding of these monasteries. She wrote about meditation on the Song of Songs. And then, of course, we have The Interior Castle, which is her most well-known book.
Yes.
And in this book, she describes the human soul as this extremely beautiful castle of clear.
I love this picture.
I know.
I think it's genius. It's obviously birthed by the Holy Spirit.
And it comes out of an encounter that she has with the Lord. And so she says it's got these many rooms and these mansions, whatever you want to call them, and God Himself dwells at the center of this castle and just continually invites the person to come and go deeper into those places of truth and love. And again, like another funny story for Teresa, when she was asked to write this book by one of her superiors, and she was not at all happy about that. She was like, oh my goodness. And so she starts by sitting down and saying, well, beloved, speaking to the Lord, I've got no idea what to say here. And so if you want me to do this thing, you're going to have to speak. And so from then on, it takes her 2 months to write the whole Interior Castle. And those who were, watching her said it was like she was in this encounter and she was just writing what the Lord was showing her. So this quote that she has at the beginning, which is one of my favorite quotes of Teresa, and she says, a thought occurred to me, a foundation on which to build. I began to think of the soul as if it were a castle made of a single diamond or very clear crystal, in which there's many rooms, just as heaven there's many mansions. Now, if we think carefully over this, the soul of the righteous man is nothing but a paradise in which, as God tells us, he takes his delight. What do you think a room will be like, which is the delight of a king, so mighty, so wise, so pure, so full of all that is good? I can find nothing with which to compare the great beauty of a soul and its great capacity. I
So
know.
beautiful. That's awesome.
You can just, it's like if God wants to dwell there, it must be this most beautiful place. And that's within us. We explore that.
So beautiful.
Yeah. And so the castle, she just, she talks you through the 7 dwellings. And each one of those dwellings has got various challenges and beauty. And then the closer and closer you get to the center where the Lord dwells, she starts to shift and change and uses different metaphors and images. And it's stunning. It's absolutely stunning.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. So yeah, you've mentioned a few of her different works, and especially obviously the interior castle, which is really great. How would you say that she has influenced church history, or how does she speak to us today in our sort of 21st century contemporary Christian context? How can we sort of apply her teachings, her revelation of God and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah. I mean, definitely her enduring legacy is the teaching she's offered the church on prayer, and on that contemplative prayer of, and she actually lays out kind of the stages of prayer of quiet, prayer of recollection, the prayer of union. So she teaches about, as you kind of go deeper into this space, this is the way to do it, and this is what will happen here, and this is how you overcome that until you get to this place, this prayer of union, which that contemplative place, and what Teresa and a lot of other spiritual writers will say is, that contemplative experience really is a gift from the Lord. It's not something that we can obtain. We just position ourselves in that encounter. And today, for us today, the thing about Teresa is she cultivated and had this life of prayer in the midst of a super busy life. I mean, she was a reformer, a leader of a reformative movement of a whole order. She established new monasteries. She answered the call of the Duchess to do this and go there, and yet her life of intimacy with the Lord doesn't skip a beat. And
I love that.
Yeah, I think for us today, and let's not forget that it wasn't like she could just jump in a car or a train, or this is the 1500s. So she was spending hours giving herself to her vocation. And so, I think today there is that challenge for us that, yes, we're busy. Yes, there's lots of distraction, leading things, whatever the case may be. But when, like Teresa, you've tasted that deep space of intimacy with the Lord, you will do anything to continue to cultivate it.
I love that.
And and make your way into that, interior space. Yeah.
Wow, that's so powerful. I love that. You've mentioned a few quotes already. Are there any other quotes that you wanted to share that have particularly spoken to you?
Not really. I mean, that one about the soul to me is kind of the pinnacle for Teresa. And then the little moments of encounter that she'd had with the Lord, and they'd be
I love that.
Yeah.
And really just go and read the interior castle. Hey, like you just need to read her. I feel like it feels like you're sitting with her and she's just telling you a story over a cup of tea. This woman who's
absolutely.
so enraptured with God.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
So
yes.
Awesome. Well, we usually finish with like maybe a bit of a fun fact, fun story. Is there anything that you want to share that you've learnt about her that's maybe stood out to you, or something that, you know, our audience wouldn't know about?
Well, I mean, I just love that story of her before the Inquisition, or through any other time when she has these amazing kind of
do what you got to do.
Yeah, revelatory. I mean, she would have been way cleverer than a lot of the people before, but knew that she was pretty, knew that she was attractive, and so she used everything that the Lord gave her. She used her mind and her heart, and she used her looks.
I love it.
And, yeah, I just love that about her.
Yeah. She seems like she doesn't take herself. She takes the Lord very, very seriously, but she seems like she doesn't take herself. She holds herself lightly in her. I don't know, herself. I don't know. That's what it seems to me. So awesome. If someone wants to get into Saint Teresa of Avila, if they want to, you know, get to know more about her, if they want to learn from her life of prayer, is there anywhere that you would particularly direct them to begin, or just dive into whatever?
So, I mean, her books are all, you know, really readily available. So her autobiography, the one on prayer, which is called, I did tell you that, The Way of Perfection, but the Interior Castle, and there's a few translations of it out there, but my favorite translation would be the one by Mirabai Starr.
Okay, cool.
I mean, she has just translated it so beautifully, so that's a beautiful place to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And also, Pastor Ali, if people want to connect with you, I know you've got a course or something about, you know, contemplative spirituality. Do you want to tell us maybe a little bit about that and how people can connect with you as well before we go?
Yeah. So we run what's called the Immersion Academy, which is an 8-month sort of deep discipleship dive. It really came out of my studies at Fuller. So it starts off sort of, you know, looking at our self-awareness and how do we identify what God is doing in us. And then it introduces sort of contemplative spirituality. And then we finish off, I touch on Teresa, but spend a lot of time talking about Ignatius of Layla, who's my other passion, and Ignatian spirituality. But, you know, people can get in contact with me through that. There's a website, theimmersionacademy.com, or through urbanchurch.com.au. You can contact me through either of those and have a look on those websites as well and tell you a little bit more about us and the church. And
beautiful. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks for giving us such a beautiful introduction to such a beautiful woman who had such an incredible and deep relationship with God. I'm always, every time I talk about her, so it feels like the Holy Spirit's just beckoning me to come deeper into that life of prayer and intimacy with Him. And I just love reading people like that. I love talking about people like that. I think it's just, it just stokes the fire in your heart, you know? So I love it. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for giving us such a great overview. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today on the Eagle and Child podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you with us. We'll catch you next time on the Eagle and Child podcast. See you soon. Bye. Thanks so much for tuning into the Eagle and Child podcast. That's all from us for today. If you want to support us, you can like, subscribe, or drop us a review. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Eagle and Child podcast. We'll catch you next time. Much love.